Welcome to another episode of the Lords of Consciousness Videocast. I am your host, Clint-culberson, and today our show has a sponsor that I wanted to give a little shout out to. Is called beyondyourmatrix.com. This site is focusing on honoring and respecting who we are as individuals, and has created t-shirts and tote bags and hats and all sorts of cool designs. You have to check these out. That are kind of sponsoring that. So check out some of their designs, beyondyourmatrix.com. And today, LOC Media is really excited because we have on a very special guest today. And I feel like a kid in a candy store. Our guest today is James-Perloff. And James is an author of The Shadows of Power, an expose on the Council on Foreign Relations that has sold over 100,000 copies, and 2 books about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution, including Tornado in a Junkyard. He wrote for the New American Magazine for nearly 3 decades. His newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is a comprehensive look at the satanic drive for world government. He also wrote the script for Free Minds Film's latest documentary, Shadow Ring, which is awesome, by the way, released in 2015, and was the lead-off speaker at the 2015 New York City Liberty Fest. His website is james-perloff.com, and he's also on Twitter as James-Perloff. James, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you, Clint. Thanks for having me on. It's great to find new faces and people working in alt media, and we were saying just before we went live how great it is to see alt media growing and having a greater impact.
Absolutely. And it's, I was telling you that, you have books that are, you wrote in the 80s that's how I found you. My one of my best friends gave me your book, The Shadows of Power. He gave it to me a couple months ago, and he keeps telling me, read it. And he's a Vietnam War vet. So it's like, after reading it now, it's really blew me away because there's so much information in there, and your history, your work, I'm a lover of history. But it's amazing to find out how much of the history we've been taught is basically written by the victors. You really start coming to that understanding that, man, mainstream history is written by the victors, and you have to understand that there's 2 sides of it. And when you agreed to come on, I was like, oh my gosh, what do I want to talk to you about? Because for anyone who knows your work, it's quite broad. I mean, it's quite deep. It's amazing the details that you've uncovered and the dots you've connected, and not even just your own discoveries, but you connecting other authors who've written other books, and really, it's like you're a great puzzle connector, and you're putting together a massively huge puzzle here, because it's, as if anyone understands it, it goes deep. It goes real deep. The rabbit holes are almost endless with what's going on, and what the world government situation has been for, it goes on, really to the beginning of time, I suppose, because every moment in history has been interconnected. It's like, I chose today, I wanted to focus on World War II, because I was thinking, let's talk about right now what's going on. You mentioned before, we're going to talk about World War II. Maybe by the end of the show, World War III will have already started, given current events. And it's true. But what I'm finding is that there's so many people that have so disjointed and disconnected in how they see it, and even not me, and even you. This thing is so big that how can anyone say they know it all? But it's when we don't understand the history, what happened 60 years ago for us to get to this point. What happened? In even World War II, I use that as a starting point, but it goes way further back than that. So really, we could go back to the beginning of time to figure this out, but I think World War II is a great jumping point, because it's like we have living people still on this planet who were part of it. So we have living testaments still of that history, and I think it's potentially one of the most monumental, 5-6 years in human history. So anyway, that's a big mouthful. I wanted to ask you, I want to start off with this idea of history written by the victors. Can you tell us why that's so vital to understand?
Well, because you're only going to hear their perspective. So if you're starting the Spanish-American War, you're never going to find out that the Spaniards didn't want a war with us, and we're bending over backwards to avoid it. If you read the history of World War I from the victors' viewpoint, you're not going to learn about the Lusitania why the Germans really sank it. It wasn't to kill women and children. It's because Lusitania was loaded down with munitions, which we could enumerate, but we won't spend time there right now. But I do have a blog post on my website called False Flag at Sea, which vets the sinking of the Lusitania. The victors will write the textbooks, and they've been writing. They're not only victorious in war, they're victorious in overwhelming their social opponents and making sure that they control the narrative, overwhelming the alt media people of their given day by controlling the mainstream media, so people never find out the truth on any subject, whether it's war or family life. So as far as World War II goes, it's interesting you said that would be a good jumping off point, because in my latest book, which is called The Truth is a Lonely Warrior, it's really a primer on the New World Order, I didn't think it would be a good jumping off point. In fact, I've got an appendix, got several appendices at the back of the book, and there's one that's almost blank. It's called Appendix 6, the Unwritten Appendix.
Oh, okay.
And I said, what I said there was that I couldn't fit that into one chapter or appendix because it's been so propagandized that it would take a whole book, and that actually is World War II. I didn't think it was a good place, but we'll try to tackle it today. The reason it's hard to debunk World War II, World War II is the one war that everybody agrees is a good war. Now, if you try to convince somebody that it wasn't such a good idea to have the Spanish-American War or the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or even World War I, they'll go along. But World War II, whether you're a liberal Democrat or conservative Republican, say that's the good one. We had to win that one. We're all in unity about that. And an interesting question to answer in order to start this is, why is it considered the good war, and why is it so impenetrable? Mm-hmm. It's the most lied about war, and I want to explain why it's the most lied about war. World War I was successfully debunked. People grew wise to the fact that the Lusitania was a false flag. It was a setup. Winston-Churchill sent the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship, straight into the path of a U-boat, and was exploited to get us into the war. And people figured out that they said during World War I it would end all wars and make the world safe for democracy. It didn't do that. And after the war, there was a committee of Congress called the Graham Committee, which found that the banksters and the industrialists had looted the American public of $6 billion for war munitions that never got manufactured or sent to the front.
Wow. And
they handed down indictments, but they're all quashed. Now, in the meantime, the American GIs are out in the front risking their lives for $30 a month. Well, people wised up to this stuff, and they said, you know what? This war was not ideal. We're not going to be tricked again. Mm-hmm. And so after World War II, they said, you know what? The establishment, now I'm talking about the deep state, they said, we're not going to let what happened to World War I happen to World War II. We're not going to let them debunk it this time. So here's a quote, and it is in The Shadows of Power, if you've read that. This is from Charles Beard, the president of the American Historical Society, right in 1947. He said this, quote, "The Rockefeller Foundation and the Council on Foreign Relations, two pillars of the establishment, intend to prevent a repetition of what they call the debunking journalistic campaign following World War I. This means that the Foundation and Council do not want journalists to examine too closely and criticize too freely the official propaganda and statements relative to our basic aims and activities during World War II. In short, they hope that the policies and measures of Franklin D. Roosevelt will escape in coming years the critical analysis, evaluation, and exposition that befell the policies and measures of Woodrow Wilson and the Allies after World War I," unquote. So how do you do that? You create the big lie. You create endless Hollywood movies. You probably noticed that they never stop making movies about what a great war World War II was. Now, you're too young to remember this, but when I was a teenager in the 60s, if you watched TV, you saw the Rat Patrol and Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah. Saw the reruns.
Yeah. And if you went to the movies, you saw The Longest Day and The Great Escape and The Dirty Dozen and endless movies about how great it was. And it never stops. And more recently, Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List and Wind Talkers and Inglourious Bastards and the Indiana Jones movies. And they never stopped reminding us that this was the good war. And so what they did was, they created the big lie. It's repeated so often that if you try to tell somebody it wasn't a good war, that they look at you like you're nuts, even though they'll accept it's some sort of challenge to any other war. But that's the reason why it's so hard to challenge, is because it's the most thoroughly propagandized war. And the reason they propagandized it was because of the successful debunking of World War I. Now,
well, and so it's so good too that if you even say any alternative story to the way the Holocaust went down, you can literally be thrown in prison. I mean, imagine that.
The books saying that on Amazon have just been banned, and they're starting to call them YouTube for videos that say something like that. But what I wanted to mainly focus on today was the true purposes of the war, number one, which won't take long. And then I wanted to talk about the false flag, using that word in a loose sense, which brought us into the war, Pearl Harbor, how that was orchestrated to get us into the war and make it truly global. And then I want to talk about the true war aims of Germany and Japan, because we were told that the pretext for the war was that they were going to conquer the world. So let's start by talking about the actual purposes of this war. And I want to connect it to the preceding history and today by showing that there's total continuity in world wars, including a potential third world war. World War I was used to create the first stab at world government. It's called the League of Nations, and it failed. So you move it up to World War II, you get a stronger, and this time permanent form of semi-world government called the UN. And of course, if they had a World War III, that's when they would get their all-powerful world government, which the Council on Foreign Relations and the rest of the globalist groups have been working at all along. Another purpose of World War II was the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, this harkens back again to World War I, which was used in 1917. During the war, they created the Balfour Declaration, which I imagine you've heard of. The Balfour Declaration was a deal between the British government and the Zionists that if the Zionists brought America into the war on Britain's side, which Britain was losing at that point, they would do that in exchange for Britain establishing Palestine as a Jewish homeland. And that's why the British went down to Palestine, and that's why you had Lawrence of Arabia down there. They were promising the Arabs that if you throw off the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, which is an ally of Germany, Britain will give you the Arabs Palestine. But what they didn't know was there was a secret deal made behind the scenes, which would give it to the Jews instead. And you now see them be cleansing the last of the, or trying to cleanse the last of the Palestinian land away. Now, if you want to know how that interconnects to world government, Jerusalem is intended to be the satanic capital of world government. That's where every government's got a capital. The world government's capital would be in Jerusalem. David Ben-Gurion said that in 1962, and other members of the deep state have said that. And it's even predicted in the Bible in the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, will rule from a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Wow. And a lot of Christians today think that Israel is the godly rebirthing of biblical Israel. It's not. It's a Rothschild plan. The Balfour Declaration was addressed from the British government to Lord Walter Rothschild. It was their scheme all along. Okay, number 3 in World War II was communism. Now, World War I created the first communist state, the Soviet Union, with millions of people being slaughtered. World War II spread communism over half the globe into Asia and Eastern Europe. In World War III, they wouldn't call it communism per se, but it would be a Leninist, Stalinist type of government, a police state, a surveillance state, gulags, concentration camps, the works. It would be that type of a government all over again. And we might as well throw in banking too. 6 months before Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, the Federal Reserve was created. What great timing. Now we've got a way to fund America's entry into World War I. Then World War II. World War II, the Council on Foreign Relations in secret developed the World Bank, even before the IMF held its first official meeting. And then World War III would, of course, create this global currency that they've been after, because with global currency, you get global control, and that would ultimately form a chip in all of us. But so there's your continuity, though, between World War I, World War II, and a potential World War III, which looks like it could be looming from these tensions being flared up with Russia and Syria right now.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the continuity, and those were
gassing of children would be a great false flag to get it going, man.
The what?
The gassing of
Yes.
children. It would be a great false flag to get it all started.
I'm surprised they didn't come up with a new false flag. They tried one that already had failed. Apparently, they're running out of ideas. But
I know. Me too. I'm waiting for the aliens. Where's the alien false flag? That's the cool one I'm waiting for.
Yeah, I think that might be coming too. But Obama tried the sarin gas false flag. It didn't work. So he went back to the drawing board when he didn't get approval for the airstrikes, and they came up with Jihadi John and ISIS beheading people. And that pushed the people's buttons, so they used that. Now, for some reason, they're going back to sarin gas. But if that doesn't work, they may try some sort of false flag. But that's World War II, World War I, and the president in sort of a...
Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you for tying that. For all those who are listening, I told you he's the great dot connector. This is James Perloff, man. James, keep going. This is amazing. I love this.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of dots. The next thing I'm going to do is talk about Pearl Harbor, which is a critical aspect of World War II, obviously, because that was the event that brought us into the war, brought America in. When the Japanese attacked our fleet in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, they destroyed or sank 18 ships. Thousands of Americans were dead. And then, of course, we declared war after that. So what we need to know is a few things about Pearl Harbor. Number one, why did the Japanese attack it? And number two, what the heck was the fleet doing there in the first place? And we're going to find there are interesting reasons for that.
Yep.
And number three, and this is very well documented, the fact that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the attack, but withheld that information from our military commanders in order that the attack would take place. So let's start by addressing the question of why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in the first place? Most Americans couldn't answer that. And the reason is this. It requires a little bit of backdrop. In the 1930s, Japan moved their troops into China. What the American public was told was this was representative of their lust for world conquest, and China is simply first on their hit list. The real reason was different. They didn't move their troops into China until Stalin had moved his troops into Outer Mongolia and seized the northwestern province of Xinjiang of China. The Japanese saw the handwriting on the wall. They saw, if you look at the map of Japan, it's across from China and the Soviet Union or Russia. Russia had now become communist, and the communists were quickly moving into Asia. And they realized that if both China and Russia were communists, that they would be isolated and destroyed. So their troops were there. This is not to dismiss the idea that there was any secondary imperialistic ambition involved, but they were primarily there to keep the Russians out and prevent communism from taking over Asia, which they were right about. History has proven them right, because by 1949, after they were defeated, communism swept China. It became Red China, and we had to fight the Korean and Vietnam Wars. So they were right. Communism was coming into Asia. Okay.
And it killed tens of millions of people thereafter, just like it did in Russia.
Yes.
When Mao took over, tens of millions of his own people starved to death. But continue.
That's right. The Black Book of Communism, which is published by Harvard University, which is very liberal, puts the number of people killed by the communists at 100 million, and not many put it well above that figure.
Wow.
Okay, so why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Well, and I'll get into the reasons for it, but the United States, combining with the Dutch and the British, put an all-out trade embargo on Japan as about August the 1st, 1941. And this embargo was strangled, and Japan was heavily populated, but didn't have a lot in the way of natural resources. They were dependent on imports for food, oil, and many other natural resources. The trade embargo was strangling them, and they were negotiating with us in earnest. Would you please lift this trade embargo? And we said no. The pretext for the trade embargo given the American public was Japan's aggression, which I've just explained. They were in there to fight a communist aggression. In fact, I just want to back that up a little bit, because this is one of those points that people will challenge. Let's see. Okay, this is a quote from How the Far East Was Lost by Professor Anthony Kubik, who was chairman of the history department at the University of Dallas. Quote, "It was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria, that's the area of it's improperly called China, but it's the part of Asia right across from Japan, in Inner Mongolia, the Soviets had taken Outer Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and seriously threaten the security of Japan. But the Department of State seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in North China. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the State Department to the Soviet Union, despite her absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time, Japan was censured for stationing troops in China. This is a double standard throughout the war. The Germans and Japanese, nothing with zero tolerance for your troops being out of your borders. But Stalin, no problem. He can invade Poland. There's no problem with that. But if Germany invades Poland, we're going to declare war. Okay, so
and that's not even to get into British imperialism. Goodness gracious, right, the greatest land conquerors of all time.
Yeah, after World War I, they added by the treaties after World War I, they added 1 million square miles to their territory. Yeah, they were very aggressive. But okay, so back to Japan. They had their troops in China, and our trade embargo was now strangling them. And they said, well, what do we have to do to lift the trade embargo? And the United States said, you have to put all your troops back into Japan's mainland. Mm-hmm. The Japanese said, well, we can't do that. And they bargained. They said, look, here's what we'll do. We'll pull all of our troops back from overseas. And by the way, you can imagine what would happen if somebody told us to pull our troops out of our 900 overseas military bases, right? We'd say that's infringement on our sovereignty. But the Japanese were very common. They said, we'll put all our troops back in, except Manchuria, which is right across the Strait of Japan from us. We have to have some troops on the mainland to defend our security interests if we're threatened by communism. So an ultimatum on November the 26th, I believe it was, 1941, was sent to Japan. It's called the Hull Ultimatum. Now, Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State. We now know this ultimatum was actually written by Harry Dexter White of the Treasury Department, who was a communist agent. And in my website, I've got an article on Pearl Harbor. It's called Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11. And I quote Time magazine on this because that's an establishment that ultimatum was written by Harry Dexter White, and he was a member of the Communist Party. That is verified, even by establishment sources. Okay, so the Japanese looked at this ultimatum. They said, okay, you've given us a choice. We can die by starvation from this trade embargo, or we can die from communism taking over China. You're going to have a death threat either way. It's a catch-22. And this is when they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. This is the reason for the attack. We gave them a death sentence that there was no escape clause from, and that's the reason. The next point is, why was the fleet in Pearl Harbor? But I pause here for any feedback from you.
No, I mean, keep going, James. This is the picture that you're painting is incredible, and this part is fascinating because the evidence behind Roosevelt and the powers that be knowing that Pearl Harbor was coming is the evidence is stacked quite high. It's quite obvious.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. But go ahead, keep going, my friend.
We're going to talk about that. Thanks, Clint. But first, I want to answer the question of why was a fleet in Pearl Harbor? I'm sure no American could answer that today for the most part, unless he'd really studied the situation. Normally, our fleet was kept in San Diego and the West Coast. And in 1940, President Roosevelt gave an order that the fleet was to be based indefinitely at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, when the fleet commander, Admiral J.O. Richardson, heard this, he flew into a rage. And he flew to Washington to meet with the president. This is October the 8th, 1940. He met with President Roosevelt and he said, Mr. President, there are many terrible reasons, why we should not put the fleet in Pearl Harbor. Okay, number one, Pearl Harbor is in the middle of the ocean. Hawaii is in the middle of the ocean. It can be surprise attack from 360 degrees. But if you leave the fleet in its normal berthing on the West Coast, you can't surprise attack it. Any enemy approaching us will run into commercial vessels. We'll get advanced warning. Nobody can hit us there. Number two, look at a map of Pearl Harbor, Ford Island. Our ships were boxed in like sardines. Ships right next to each other, making them perfect targets for bombers. Right. Reason number three, the fleet would have to be resupplied over 2,000 miles of Pacific. Very hard to do. You want to bring in oil or new personnel. It's 2,000 miles. You want to keep the fleet in a war fleet and keep it on the West Coast, not in Pearl Harbor, which has very bad dry docks and poor oil storage facilities. Okay, reason number 4. The population of Hawaii was 37% ethnically Japanese, which means since our relations with Japan are tense right now, we're setting ourselves up for a sabotage and espionage. Why would you want to do that, Mr. President? Okay, reason number 5. Separating the entire Pacific Fleet from their families is going to be really bad for our troop morale.
Yeah.
Okay, he's giving him all these reasons. Roosevelt's response, he says, well, Admiral Richardson, I'm going to put the fleet there because it will deter Japanese aggression. Well, Clint, as of December the 7th, 1941, everybody knew it did not deter Japanese aggression. But guess what? Establishment historians have always faulted the Navy and have held up President Roosevelt as a hero, never faulted him for this decision to put the fleet there against the wishes of the Navy. And by the way, after this meeting with Roosevelt, Admiral Richards was fired by President Roosevelt as head of the American fleet.
What a shocker.
He spoke to Frank Knox, the Navy Secretary. He said, Frank, it's unprecedented for a fleet commander to be fired without reason. Could you tell me the reason? And he said, the president will meet with you. And President Roosevelt promised to meet with him, never did. And finally, Frank Knox told Admiral Richardson, you made the president unhappy when you were last here. And that was the reason he was fired. But the real reason was that he stood in the way of this horrible decision. But that's why we were in Pearl Harbor. It was Roosevelt's decision, old naval advice. What he was doing, he was giving the Japanese bait to attack.
Yeah, it's like what a bully would do. You know, you keep smacking someone around, you put them in a corner, and then you stick the bait out, like you said, because all you're doing is waiting for them to make the first punch, and then you declare them the great evil because they punched you first. Yet we don't talk about the backing in the corner endlessly. There, it's like you said. There was, what choice did Japan have at the end of the day?
Let's back up just what you were saying. I should mention that having Japan attack us was not the original plan. In World War I, the Germans had sunk the Lusitania. That got us a declaration of war. Mm-hmm. Original plan was to have the Germans sink an American ship. And for that reason, Roosevelt ordered American destroyers who were escorting British convoys in 1940-41 to start depth charging German U-boats. And the Germans wouldn't fire back. They wouldn't defend themselves because they were under strict orders not to do so. I'm going to quote Admiral Dönitz, who was head of the U-boat force of Germany. This was said at Nuremberg, quote, a 300-mile safety zone was granted America by Germany when international law called for only a 3-mile zone. I suggested minefields at Halifax, Canada, and around Iceland, but the Führer rejected this because he wanted to avoid conflict with the United States. When American destroyers in the summer of 1941 were ordered to attack submarines, I was forbidden to fight back. I was thus forced not to even attack British destroyers for fear there might be some mistake, unquote. You see, Clint, the Germans knew that America coming into World War I had caused their defeat. Mm-hmm. They couldn't resist all those American soldiers along with the rest of the Allies. And they did not want another war with America. So when Roosevelt realized this, he said, we've got to find another way into this war. And so in 1941, the Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes, wrote to Roosevelt, quote, our best entrance of the world would be by way of Japan, unquote. And then that autumn, 1941, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, Council on Foreign Relations, Skull and Bones, wrote this in his diary, quote, this is right after the meeting with Roosevelt, quote, we face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be sure that Japan is put in the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. The question is how we should move them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot, unquote. And one more I'm going to give you from Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of Naval Intelligence. He presented President Roosevelt with an 8-step plan of provocation against Japan, which closed with these words, quote, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, unquote. And the last step of that plan was the all-out trade embargo. Yeah. And that's, of course, what they were acting on. And and to further back this up, I'm going to give you a quote from a British historian named Russell Grenfell, who was a captain in the Royal Navy. He wrote this in 1952, quote, no reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack in the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be put on the Japanese to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States, unquote, Russell Grunfeld. And you'll find more quotes like that in my article on my website, james-perloff.com. The article, again, is Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11.
It's incredible, man. It's like it's one of the biggest false flags of the last 100 years, and it's I mean, people, it's, false flags, at least in the mainstream, seem to only that term started to come into a wider understanding just after 9/11. And then you don't,
yes, right.
And then as you realize and you go back in time, it's a tale as old as time. It's been there. It's been the controller's greatest tool to make their agenda take place throughout the world. It's unbelievable. And it's, thank you for, man, James, I love this because your work is you like I said, you're the great dot connector, man. And when you pull these things together, you back up these claims. This, I want to just make sure that people understand. James and I are not some like Nazi supporters, and we have in our closets in our house we have like Adolf Hitler shrines or some bullshit like that. We're anti-Jew or anything like that. And I've heard you say this in other interviews too. So like we want to make sure that people understand this. We just want to be able to speak what is. There's no agenda. We just want to know the truth at the end of the day. And that's why this is so important. So I wanted to kind of see if you could, connect the dot then between the alliance of Japan and Germany and Italy and what that was based on. I mean, in our world, we call it the axis of powers. It's almost like, as a child, it was Darth Vader meeting up with, the evil emperor and, to take over the world. And that's what history taught us. That's what the Axis powers was. But what was their connection? Because once Pearl Harbor happened, we basically just lumped Germany in and we declared war on them as well, correct?
Technically, the first declaration of war came from Germany against us as part of their pact, which you were just describing. In that pact, they signed something called the Anti-Comintern Pact. And their intention, they'd seen that Lenin and Stalin, Soviet Union was constantly expanding, and it had absorbed Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, these various Muslim states. As I said, it had moved into China, out of Mongolia. It was threatening the world. And they wanted to form a defensive alliance against it. And I'm going to be making more points about this when we talk about the war aims of Germany. But that was basically their belief. And I have to say this too. This is a fairly good segue for it. I mentioned that trade embargo against Japan, the all-out trade embargo, food, oil, and other imports that Japan required. It was enacted in August of 1941. It was August the 1st. Now, when did Operation Barbarossa begin? This is when Germany and her allies invaded the Soviet Union, June the 22nd, 1941. And the Axis powers were crushing the Russians. Millions of, or at least hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were surrendering. They were saying Stalin kaput. Stalin was frozen. He didn't know what to do. And it was very, very clear to the deep state that if Japan ended the war from the east and had a very powerful military, powerful Air Force, Navy, and Army, that Stalin would be caught in a vise. And it became imperative that Japan not attack Russia. And that was part of Japan's agenda. There were Japanese statements who were statesmen who were pushing for this. And the trade embargo, you can't prosecute a war without oil. You can't make tanks run or ships. And by cutting off oil, you couldn't go to OPEC then. You had to go through the British or the Dutch or the Americans to get oil. So by cutting off oil, Japan, it was guaranteed that they would not join Operation Barbarossa. The way they could get oil was by striking to the south of the Dutch East Indies. But that was the purpose of the timing of that trade embargo, was to make sure that Stalin was not decimated by a two-front war. It was to get Japan away from Stalin and to offer that fleet as bait and get him embroiled in a war with us. That took all the heat off of the Soviet Union, which, if you study history, and the best book I can recommend on this is called Under the Sign of the Scorpion by Yuri Lina, Lina. He vetted the history of early Russia from studying the released files after Glasnost, the released KGB files. He even found that the Tsar was ordered executed. The orders came from New York, not from Lenin. Even Lenin didn't have the guts to, So they were saving their proxy state, the Soviet Union, by that trade embargo and redirecting Japan's attention. But basically, yes, they were forming an alliance with surrounding Russia, and I can show you quotes from communist officials that they were very, very eager that Japan became embroiled with a war with the United States, which of course would facilitate the slide of communism into Asia.
Wow, unbelievable! To have lived during that time period must have been something else. I mean, what a truth, and to live, on the borders of the Soviet Union, all those countries that were Eastern Europe, and like you said, all the way into Asia,
the Baltic states.
Yeah, everything. It's unbelievable, and it was a true threat. What was the Soviets? What was the spread of communism like? Why was it the true aggressor? Why was it trying to take over other countries to get their ideology into other places? I mean, what was the motivation behind that, and who backed it? I'm sorry to diverge a little bit, but just the true aggressors.
Communism has never been nationalistic. It's always been an international movement to establish a worldwide communist state. And of course, it poses as the savior of the masses, the proletariat. I finally figured out that there's a reason why the communists said they're for the proletariat. It's because if you look at the words of, this is just a paraphrase, but Trotsky said, "We will destroy the intelligentsia." So in Russia, they wiped out the judges and the lawyers and the authors and the poets. Anybody who was quite intelligent to oppose them, they got rid of. And they just wanted a few peasants tilling the land. That's when the Germans came in during World War II, they mostly just found peasants and thatched roof huts. They didn't find much in the way of an intelligentsia. And of course, that didn't really help Stalin when he was trying to fight the Germans. He wiped out his best people. But communism wasn't very much an international movement, just as the globalism is. And communism is certainly attached to globalism. It's an attempt to take over the world.
And it's so crazy that that there's seemingly the most free part of the world, the United States and Western Europe, the powers behind that are, and you prove this well in your books too, are the same powers behind the Bolsheviks and the communist movement. So it's like it's such a trip to think that America has actually had a huge influence in creating communism, and yet of course then thereafter, after World War II, especially where the Cold War starts. But anyway, I know there's so many rabbit holes we can jump down from here, but I could ask you questions, but I almost want you to take this where you want to go, or in terms of explaining the next steps of this.
I want to just give you a quote that helps to clarify this a little bit, this relationship between communism and the capitalist West.
Perfect.
There's a quote from Nicholas Murray Butler of the Fabian Society. He said this, quote, Fabian Society, of course, is socialist. He said this, quote, "Communism is the instrument by which the financial world can topple national governments and then erect a world government with a world police and a world money," unquote. And so communism is basically a tool used to overthrow leaderships, rulers, monarchs that are not attached to the New World Order, to clear the way for the New World Order. That's part of it. And if you want to look for documentation of the financing of communism by the West, I would recommend a book that I really like the best is Red Carpet by Joseph Finder. Okay. And he interviewed people like David Rockefeller and why he had all these, bank deals with the Russians, even costing them money. Mm-hmm. And David Rockefeller, who passed away, of course, very recently, during even the height of the Cold War, his private jet had landing rights in Moscow during the Cold War. And another good book, of course, is Anthony Sutton's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which documents the fight between Wall Street and Bolshevism. But we should probably head back to Pearl Harbor.
I know. Yeah, it's so hard. You have to reel yourself back in from all these different directions. No worries. Go ahead.
But the other thing to know about Pearl Harbor, besides the fact that we provoked the attack and set up the fleet there against naval advice, was the foreknowledge of the attack. And I just want to mention there's many books that have documented that Pearl Harbor's attack was foreknown. You go back to 1947, you have this book, Pearl Harbor by George Morgenstern. This is a new cover, but nice. He had a lot of documentation that had come out in congressional inquiries and Army and Navy inquiries. And in 1954, you had this book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, subtitled The Washington Contribution by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor commanding destroyers on the day of the attack. Wow. There's another book, this is pretty recent. This is Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor by Robert Stinnett, who used Freedom of Information Act to uncover a lot of new material. But there's many other books I don't have to hand here. I think the best book on it is a book by a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, John Tolan. It's called Infamy, Pearl Harbor and its Aftermath. You can also read Admiral Kimmel's book, Admiral Kimmel's story. Admiral Kimmel was the Pacific Fleet commander at the time of Pearl Harbor, and his family spent much of their life fighting to prove that he was denied the information that Washington had. And I'll also mention that Pearl Harbor was investigated during World War II by both a Naval Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board, both of which found that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the attack. But those findings were suppressed in the interest of national security. And then to invalidate these findings, the Roosevelt administration strong-armed many of the officers who had testified before these commissions and had them change their testimony. You had, for example, Colonel Rufus Bratton had testified that he delivered Japan's declaration of war to the decoded transcript of it to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. Well, later on, after the Army Pearl Harbor Board, he was flagged down on the road by an attorney for Roosevelt's new commission, where he was handed affidavit showing, insisting that the Chief of Staff had never gotten this report from Brad. So what did Brad? Well, it's my word against the Army Chief of Staff. What do I have to do? So he recanted and he signed a new affidavit. But this information has been known since the time of World War II. And let me just, if you don't want to watch videos, watch the BBC documentary. It's on YouTube. It's called Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. Even the BBC was politically incorrect in the 80s to document that Pearl Harbor was known about in Washington. And, this is not something that tinfoil hat conspiracists believe, but people in our own Navy Department, right down to the commanders at Pearl Harbor and our own generals and admirals sitting on official boards all documented this. So this is real. It's very real. But the other thing we need to do is explain how Washington knew about the attack.
Yes. Just keep surfing the wave, James. This is the easiest interview I've ever done. You asked the questions yourself, for crying out loud. I love it.
Well, I've been around the block on the subject.
Oh, I know you have.
I can't surf for real, but I'm glad I can surf the web. And
hey, the more time people will Google search James Perloff World War II or whatever, the real World War II, and the more interviews you have out there doing this, I think it's that information spreads and people. Then that starts the dam starts cracking, and so this is great. This is great.
Well, again, for documentation of this, you can read my article on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11, but in there you will find all these references, which you can then go and check yourself.
Absolutely.
But there are three basic ways that Washington knew about the Pearl Harbor attack, and the first was this. We had successfully cracked Japan's diplomatic code, and this is the code that they would use to communicate from Tokyo to the various embassies and consulates around the world. And it's a very complicated code. It had to be encoded by a machine and decoded by a machine. And the Japanese were confident nobody could break it. But we had some very talented guys in our cryptanalysis department in the Army and Navy department. So we developed our own machine after cracking the code. And we were actually able to read their diplomatic messages on a same-day basis. So we know, for example, that Tokyo had instructed its spies in Honolulu to start sending Tokyo the precise locations of each ship and dock. Now, if spies are told to watch ship movements, that's not particularly suspicious. But when they're told to give Tokyo the exact location of every ship and dock, you know you've been targeted for attack.
Oh, yeah. But
for some reason, Russian didn't feel this was important to share with our commanders in Hawaii, who did not have a machine of their own. But I should also mention that, if you watch the standard Hollywood movies about Pearl Harbor, like Tora, 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 you will see the Japanese ambassadors handing their declaration of war to the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull after the attack. And Hull is shocked and surprised. See, Hull had already read it. He'd read the transcript of the Declaration of War, so he knew all about it, as did Roosevelt. They knew the attack was coming, but they did not bother to inform our commanders in Hawaii. They sent them warnings, but they made sure that the warnings were timed in a way that they would arrive after the attack, and that would leave them off the hook. I mean, we tried to warn Pearl Harbor, but alas, we were too late. What a tragedy. We did our best, but they didn't. They knew about the attack for months, and that's one way we knew. Another way we knew was through personal warnings that Washington we had, and there were plenty of those that were coming. For example, our ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, sent a message to Washington in 1941. Okay, here it is. He sent this to Roosevelt, quote, "The Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he's heard from many sources that in the event of trouble breaking out between the United States and Japan, the Japanese intend to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor with all their strength." It's pretty obvious. He was also warned by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and Hoover got his information from a Yugoslavian double agent named Dusko Popov. He was worked for the Germans and for us, but he heard it from the Germans, and he passed it on to Hoover, who passed it on to Roosevelt. And you can actually see Dusko Popov interviewed in that BBC documentary I mentioned, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. Also, the Dutch learned of this attack. The Dutch were running Java at that time. They had cracked Japan's codes. They learned of the attack, and they passed it on to our military observer in Java, was named Elliot Thorpe, Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe. He's interviewed. You can see him interviewed, talking firsthand in that BBC documentary. He said he sent a total of 4 warnings about Pearl Harbor to Washington, and finally was advised by the War Department, send us no more warnings concerning Pearl Harbor. The Dutch had their naval attaché, F.J.L. Weigeman, personally warned our Chief of Staff, George Marshall, Freemason, I'll mention, about the attack. Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies both learned of the attack. They had private audiences with the president, and both men were told by the president, just leave this in my hands, but make sure that no word of this reaches the news services. So I'm just hitting the tip of the iceberg here, but there were many warnings that were not passed on to Pearl Harbor. And the third way is really covered in this book, Day of Deceit, which broke new ground because Stinnett uncovered the fact that Washington had not only cracked the diplomatic codes, but the naval codes of Japan. And we were reading their naval messages. And as they approached Pearl Harbor, they didn't maintain complete silence. They maintained discretion, but they would occasionally send a message. And we were reading those intercepts. And here's the most important one, I think. Admiral Yamamoto to the Japanese Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941, quote, "The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order." Wow. Now, obviously, nobody could read these things and not know what they meant, or think that Pearl Harbor should not know these things. That's
pretty clear cut. I want to ask you if you could, again, this is a very deep rabbit hole that would take a long time, but could you quickly help us understand who was behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's another line of these. When you read your book, it's very obvious that when a presidential candidate comes up to run for office, there is a humongous machine that's behind them that is getting them into power. Can you quickly, what were FDR's motivations, or the people that were behind him? I mean, who were these people?
Okay.
Quickly, I want to kind of keep it back to World War II in terms of the events that take place, but I think it's important, and if you want to lump Churchill in there too, that's fine. Like so other people understand. Churchill and FDR are always pictured as these, heroes of our time. They were, these good guys, and
the part of it, the deep state is behind them. That's who is actually is running the show. I'm sure you've realized that we basically have actors in front of the cameras, and today they use teleprompters. Mm-hmm. But over the years, and in my book, The Shadows of Power, I talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the cabinet level recruiting ground to keep the presidents in line. And let me see if I wasn't quite prepared for this.
Sorry, I know.
But let me give you some numbers. Going through the Obama administration, 19 secretaries of state, 21 treasury secretaries, 23 defense secretaries, and 16 CIA directors were drawn for the ranks of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is like it's a training ground that was established in 1921, a globalist training ground that would turn Goldman Sachs bankers into mm-hmm. diplomats. And this is why there's so little policy change when you go from a Democrat to Republican back to a Democrat, because you got the same organization dominating the presidential cabinets.
Yep. And
their goal since the very beginning has been a world government. They were specifically established in 1921 because in 1919, the Senate had rejected our entering the League of Nations. We know that first step towards world government we were discussing earlier. And their flagship journal, Foreign Affairs, their very first issue had an article called "The Next American Contribution to Civilization." Would that be join the League of Nations? So they've mm-hmm. been about the Kyoto Protocol and world government ever since then. And they realize they can't get it directly through the UN now, so they use these things like trade agreements, NAFTA, mm-hmm. TPP, things like that as building blocks of world government. The NAFTA, EU, these are all building blocks to gradually get us into this one world dictatorship, which it's got a Luciferian agenda behind it. But the people behind Roosevelt, let me just get a quote from you, and I found this just maybe about 5 years ago, but this is from Ferdinand Lundberg's 1937 book called America's 60 Families. So he wrote this, quote, "The United States is owned today by a hierarchy of its richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy, which dominates the United States, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist, has gradually taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy," unquote. Bear in mind, that's from 80 years ago. So this stuff has been going on forever. Mm-hmm. This is the deep state. This is the powers that be. And as far as the reasons for World War II, this is what we went over at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Get the UN, get the World Bank, spread communism over the globe, and establish the state of Israel, the ultimate capital of this world government. So that's who's behind Roosevelt, and Perfect. That's who is
Thank you.
What their goal.
Okay, thank you for covering that. And there's a very similar story with Churchill. So I think it's really important to just understand that, because man, the propaganda history that we learned growing up is something literally it's inverted. And it's as you discover so many truths about the world, you really realize that reality has been flipped literally on its head. It's a total inversion of everything, and so that's why even I'm sure some people hear you and maybe even have emotional reactions to what you're saying, like, what? Oh my gosh, what are you talking about? Because it's like their world is being flipped by what you're even saying. And, and that's where all the, oh, you're a racist, or you're a this, or you're a that, or it's like, but it's important that the more we say it, and the truth, I always say this, and well, it's from a quote from Terrence McKenna, who said, the truth will survive any test you put it up against, and that's why you're so great at dot connecting, is because you back it up. Find your own opinions. You don't have to listen to James. He's got all the he's got the data in his blog post that you're putting on your website. If you want to research it yourself, make your own opinion up. But
absolutely. Speaking of that racist term, I should probably just mention, since we're in the context of World War II, I am half Jewish. The Perloff family was named Perlovsky originally, and we came over from Russia in 1904. So
nice. There you go.
That's kind of a knee-jerk accusation that people sometimes make if you criticize World War II. And as far as the people's reactions are quite right. And this is what we went over at the beginning, that this is the good war. It's been so well propagandized into a big lie by constant repetition, Hollywood movies, that people think that, how can that possibly be?
Yep.
I want to move on to what the actual war aims of Germany and Japan were. But before we do, go back to see if any other questions.
No. Your turn. I would keep going. Keep telling the story.
All right. So we talked about the real reasons for the war. So what were the public pretexts? And the public pretexts were that Japan and Germany wanted to conquer the world. When you realize that Japan started smaller than the state of Montana, you start to, is that really possible, But here's one that I really want to stress is, despite what people believe, no document has ever been found in a German archive indicating that Germany had a plan to conquer the world. Adolf Hitler never said in any speech or privately to any individual that Germany was going to conquer the world, nor did any German statesman or general ever state at any time that Germany was going to conquer the world. The idea that they were going to conquer the world existed only in Hollywood movies, speeches by Roosevelt, and editorials in the New York Times.
Right.
And there's a little anecdote I want to tell you that I just think kind of underscores this. There was this former German officer named Hans Schmidt. He's now passed away, who I corresponded with. He wrote a book about his experiences in World War II. He was a lieutenant, I guess we call him an Oberleutnant, in the German armed forces. And during the Battle of the Bulge, he was instructed to command a detachment bringing some American prisoners back behind the lines. By the way, I should mention that 99% of all American POWs survived the war, which is a pretty good record.
Wow.
They knocked on a door of a French farmhouse when it got dark, and they said, "Can we stay here, for the night?" And the farmers said, "We could sleep in the barn." So they took up quarters in the barn, and the Germans discovered a bottle of schnapps hidden in the hay. They offered it to their American prisoners first. The prisoners said, no. They thought, the Germans are trying to poison us, So the Germans started passing the bottle back and forth. And when the Americans saw the booze was good, they accepted it. So now the bottle's going back and forth between the Americans and the Germans. And when the Germans said, we have a question we've always wanted to ask you Americans. He spoke fairly good English. And he said, what are you Americans doing over here in Europe? And so one of the Americans said, well, we have to stop you Germans from conquering the world. Well, the Germans just looked at each other and laughed because, nobody in Germany had ever heard that before. I mean, that was news to them. Now, if somebody heard what I just said, I'll tell you what they're most likely going to say. They're going to say, well, look, I don't care what the Germans said. Their actions speak for themselves. First, they took the Rhineland. We appeased that. Then they had the union with Austria, the Anschluss. We appeased them again. Then they took back the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and we appeased them again. But then they invaded Poland, and we said no more, and we stopped appeasing them. Then they invaded France. Then they tried to invade Britain, but the RAF held off the vicious German invasion. And since Hitler couldn't conquer Britain, he turned his hungry eyes east and he invaded Russia. And they say, oh, look at all these evidences and proofs that Russia wanted to conquer the world. So I just want to vet that, and I want to, well, maybe we can't vet it, but we can certainly look at a lot of it. And I want to go backwards.
That's it.
I want to start with the war against Russia, because if you actually look at the war against Russia, the Operation Barbarossa was not just Germany invading Russia; it was the armies of Finland, Croatia, Italy, Hungary, and Romania. So 6 European nations, not one. And along with that, even though Spain was technically neutral, 47,000 Spanish soldiers left their homeland and went to fight on the Eastern Front. And 2 divisions of Belgian volunteers, I stress volunteers, who are not, impressed with the service by the Germans. And we always think of the Belgians as being enslaved by the Germans or something. Actually, they didn't like the Americans or the British any more than the Germans. But there were 2 divisions, one a Flemish-speaking division and also a French-speaking division. And a great book to read on this is called Campaign in Russia by Leon de Grelle, who rose from a private to the commander of one of the Belgian divisions. Very literate book. But so if you're going to say that the invasion of Russia was about conquering the world, well, were the Finns trying to conquer the world and the Spaniards and the Belgians? The reason for the war was they wanted to destroy Bolshevism. Communism had murdered millions of people. They wanted to get it out of the way. And let me just quote Otto Skorzeny. He's another one that's got a lot of, I think they're great stories now in alt media. There's all kinds of cognitive dissonance. But here's what he actually wrote. He said, quote, "Like me, these volunteers wanted to fight Bolshevism and prevent Europe from being taken over by it. We wanted to defend the soil of Europe and Germany, not as Nazis, quote unquote, but as patriots and soldiers." And that really sums up the attitude. I've got a lot of memoirs of German soldiers and letters to home and diaries, which are actually illegal to keep because they didn't want to, the diary get captured that might reveal some military information. But never once have I heard a German soldier say, "Oh, I can hardly wait till we conquer this Russia so we can move there." And they wanted to get home. They didn't want anything to do with it. They wanted to kick Stalin and the Bolsheviks out. That was their motive.
Right.
So that's the war in Russia in a nutshell. Now, as far as the wars against England and France go, and this is an important one. I've got this book. The subject's important. I've got this book called "Adventures of My Youth: German Soldier on the Eastern Front" by Armin Scheidenbauer. And here's his biography. Iden Scheidenbauer was born in 1924, the son of an evangelical pastor. After attending schools in Thuringia, he's called up in August 1941. He served with distinction on the Eastern Front until 1945 with the 252nd Infantry Division, reached the rank of Oberleutnant, was wounded numerous times, awarded the Iron Cross First Class Close Combat Class. He was wounded and captured by the Red Army in 1945, returning home in September 1947. In the post-war years, he became a senior lawyer in Vienna and continued his close association with the evangelical church. So not your Nazi type of guy, nice guy. But in this book, which he originally wrote as a memoir for his daughter, he explained why they had a war with England and France. He said, "They declared war on us." If somebody declared war in America, we'd fight them, right? They had no choice once war was declared. But the Germans looked at it this way: they remembered World War I and how millions had died in this endless trench warfare. And they said, "We're not going through that again. We're going to end this thing one and done." So they went through Belgium, and in less than 2 months, France was defeated. The German army was busted. They were on the beaches of Dunkirk. They said, "Go home." The Germans thought the war was over. Now you've got all this talk about how they were going to try and conquer Britain.
Right.
Here's a historical fact. When France surrendered, there were 3.8 million German soldiers in France. As soon as the armistice was signed, Germany pulled 3.3 million back into Germany, leaving behind 500,000. That's not a force that's about to invade Britain. They didn't want any part of a war with Britain. And if you read this excellent book by Pat Buchanan, who's no skin, right? It's called "Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War." He points out, if Germany was going to invade England, they would have been building tank ferries and troop transports. They had no interest. They did have something called, what was it? I'm sorry. There was an operation plans for a invasion of England. It'll probably come to me in a minute.
Oh my gosh, ladies and gentlemen, James Perloff forgot a name. First time ever. I can't believe you can remember all the names you do.
What was it called? But anyway, Hitler never looked at those plans to invade England. He had zero interest.
So were the attacks on London from Germany, were they retaliation for bombings from Britain then?
Well, I see you've read your history. So I've pulled out so many papers now that I'm having. Okay, wait a minute. I'm going to get this caught up now. I hope. Well, in any event, yeah. Let's address that. Who bombed who first, right?
Yeah.
Germany thought the war was over when they defeated the British and the French in 1940. But here's a quote from James Spate, who's principal secretary to the Air Ministry, meaning the RAF, Royal Air Force. Quote, Hitler only undertook the bombing of British civilian targets reluctantly 3 months after the RAF commenced bombing German civilian targets. Hitler would have been willing at any time to stop the slaughter. Hitler was genuinely anxious to reach with Britain an agreement confining the action of aircraft to battle zones, unquote, James Spate. This is from Dennis Richards in his book, The Royal Air Force, 1939 to 1945, published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. Quote, the primary purpose of these raids was to goad the Germans into undertaking reprisal raids of a similar character on Britain. Such raids would arouse intense indignation in Britain against Germany and so create a war psychosis without which it would be impossible to carry on a modern war. These bombings started the day that Winston Churchill became prime minister. And we're talking about the London Blitz, right? The bombing of London. Mm-hmm. You should be pointing out there were 6,000 British casualties from that. But many times more that died in one night at Dresden when the British dropped 650,000 incendiary bombs on that city, which was a peaceful city. They weren't dropping bombs on the German soldiers. They were out of the Eastern Front. They were bombing women and children and the elderly and the people in the hospitals. This went on in Hamburg and Cologne and all the other German cities. That's, I think, a pretty good description about Holocaust. And as far as Churchill went, Churchill had been bailed out of the 29 crash by Bernard Baruch, and then he lost it again in 1937. He was bailed out by Henry Strakosch, who was a Jewish gold mining, South African gold mine magnate. And from then on, the bankers owned him, and he did whatever they told him, whatever Victor Rothschild, the most powerful banker in England, told him to do, he did. He ordered Victor Rothschild head of state security for World War II. So the point being that as soon as the Germans retaliated, Winston Churchill took American diplomats and newspapermen to show the damage, and he said, "Oh, you've got to save us." And people still think this. We had lonely Britain standing alone against the German onslaught when the Germans were trying to end this war. I should mention that Germany made more than 20 peace offers to England to end this war, more than 20. And the best book you can really read about not only that, but World War II itself. That's going to be hard for me to pick this up. It's so big. Got, I think, 1,700 footnotes. It's The Ruling Elite, Part 3 by Diana Spangola. She's a voluminous researcher.
That's a big book.
Yeah, that's a big book. The Ruling Elite, Part 3. It's all about World War II, what really went on. And
how much? Can I interject real quick, James? How much of Nazis' aggression towards France and England, well, we'll call it aggression, was linked to the Treaty of Versailles and how the Germans were being treated post World War I in terms of the retributions they had to pay, and how their economy was in the shitter, because of these payments that they had to make, and people were their money wasn't worth nothing, and people were I think starving even in the 30s or before, in the late 20s or whatever. Did that have anything to do with it, or was that more where Germany started rearming themselves? That was more towards that. Can you kind of explain those implications? It
was the latter. It was the affairs with the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and Poland were all about recovering their lost territories, which we can get to. We're kind of moving backwards here. Yeah. France and England was a direct result of the declaration of war. Germany wasn't really expecting that declaration of war, but they said, well, we're going to have to fight it. Let's do it quick. Let's win quick. Let's get it over with and end it. And unlike World War I and II, where the Allies demanded unconditional surrender, there was no unconditional surrender demanded of Britain or France. It's like, war's over, go home.
Right.
Let's end it. Let's end it. They didn't want to continue the war. It was Churchill with that incessant bombing, and then the invasion of Russia. I should mention, we talked about the desire to destroy Bolshevism. Would not have occurred had Stalin not put 170 divisions on his Western Front. Even Brezhnev, the Soviet premier, in his memoirs, said that Stalin was planning to invade Europe. He thought that the war between England, France, and Germany had so weakened Europe that he could invade. And one reason why so many Russian soldiers were captured in the first month of Operation Barbarossa was that the Russian soldiers were bunched up for invasion. They weren't arrayed in depth for defense. But I probably wandered just a little bit here. It was the recovery of those first lands that was the addressing the wrongs of the Versailles Treaty.
Got it.
But to kind of return to Germany's peace offers, their peace to England through every neutral source: the United States, the Vatican, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, Spain, let's see. There's a quote from Karl Hochhofer, who told the OSS in a post-war, did I pronounce it right? Haushofer, I'm sorry. He told the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, post-war interview, quote, 1941, Germany put out peace fillers to Great Britain through Switzerland. My son Albrecht was sent to Switzerland. There he met a British confidential agent, Lord Templewood. And this peace proposal we offered to relinquish Norway, Denmark, and France. But Churchill would not tolerate any of these peace offers. Here's a direct quote from Churchill to the Vatican, quote, I hope will be made clear to the nuncio, we do not desire any inquiries as to terms of peace with Hitler. All of our agents are strictly forbidden to entertain any such suggestions, unquote. So he was not interested in peace. The Germans were, contrary to everything we're told. And if you did talk to the British, you'd be thrown in prison under what they call the 18B regulation. I don't have it to hand, but I have a great book called From Admiral to Cabin Boy. It's written by the former head of British naval intelligence, Admiral Barry Domville. He was thrown in prison because he said that Germany didn't want a war with Britain. And under the regulation 18B, you didn't even have to have a trial or formal accusation. You just got thrown in prison in the interest of national defense. It's kind of like the Patriot Act.
Right. Sounds very familiar.
Yeah. So the British were trying to end the war, and there's one crescendo to this, which I really have to get into. This is the thread that I pulled that got me interested in learning the truth about World War II. It was a flight of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the personal deputy of Adolf Hitler, deputy Führer. He was the only man in Germany who could sign a peace treaty other than Adolf Hitler. And on the night of May the 10th, 1941, he flew to Scotland with a peace offer. Now, the date of May the 10th is no coincidence. In June of 1941, the war broke out between Russia and Germany. Germany did not want a two-front war. They were desperate to finally end this war with Britain. So Hess went there with Hitler's knowledge, and it's to try to make the story as short as possible. He was to land at the landing strip at the castle of Lord Hamilton, who was the highest-ranking peer in Scotland, and it was a friend of Hess. He had a private landing strip. The lights were turned on, but Churchill got wind of this plot, turned off the lights. Hess kept circling. He finally had to turn the plane upside down. He parachuted out, broke his leg, but he parachuted to the ground, was captured by the Scottish Home Guard. And then he was quickly scooped up by the British. Now,
wow, I didn't even know about this.
Okay, this is a great story. Rudolf Hess, if you can get big books, I've got a book called Double Standards by 5 British historians, which is pretty good on this. Rudolf Hess. Let me just get my notes here because I'm going to give you some quotes. Okay, here's the first headline in London's The Times. Quote, Hitler's deputy escapes to Britain. New York Times, Hess, deserting Hitler, flies to Scotland. So Hess had been captured by the Scottish Home Guard. The story made it to the local Scottish newspapers. They couldn't deny that Hess came there. So as a cover story, they said, Hess didn't come here to offer peace. He just wanted to get away from Hitler. If he really wanted to get away from the Germans, why not have a press conference and have him denounce Germany? Instead, they threw him in the Tower of London and then other prisons. And then the story got over to the U.S., to the American Mercury magazine, which is one of the alt media publications back then, saying that he brought a peace offer. This rumor had gotten through the Scottish back to America. And then Roosevelt was desperate. He sent a message to Churchill, said, what are we going to do about this? So they came up with a new plan, which is declared that Hess was a madman. He was nuts. And they actually sent David Cameron, who was the guy that founded MK Ultra for the CIA, to spend time with him. They electroshocked him, apparently drugged him out, tried to make him look crazy to back up this story that he was a madman.
Wow.
Okay, now the story gets more interesting. In 1947, he was at Nuremberg. He was given a life sentence. The British judge asked for a death sentence, but you had to get a majority at Nuremberg asking for death. And the French and the American judges said, well, you don't see this guy did anything wrong. He spent almost a whole war in your prison, you know. So he was sent to prison, Spandau prison, along with other German prisoners. Now, by 1967, all the other prisoners had either died or been released. And Hess was the only prisoner at Spandau prison for the next 20 years. Now, this was a prison built to hold 600 prisoners, and it was maintained at a cost of $100 million a year for this one prisoner. Wow. It was under rotating guards of French, German, Russian, and American soldiers for all these years, 200 soldiers for this one man. And people started saying, what's going on? This mystery of Rudolf Hess, why is he still there? What the British said, it's because the Russians won't let him go. But then Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and Gorbachev was asked at a press conference, what about Rudolf Hess? What's the deal with him being still in prison? And Gorbachev said, we don't care about Hess. The guy can go home. Well, when this news was announced, Hess's nurse, he was now a very old man in his 90s, was very excited. He told, well, Mr. Hess, you can go home. You go home to your family. And this wonderful news, you've been in prison for 46 years now. He said, I'll never get out of here. The British will kill me. That's what he told his son, and that's what he told his nurse. Sure enough, just before he was to be released, there was a news flash around the world. Rudolf Hess hangs himself at Spandau prison. Now, Rudolf Hess was 93. He had a stroke. He couldn't even brush his teeth or tie his shoelaces, but we're supposed to believe he hanged himself right before he was to go home. His family demanded an independent autopsy, which found he'd been throttled, not hung, throttled. Okay, and then it was made to look like a suicide. And I will give you one quote. We're almost done with Hess. Let me give a quote. This is from Hans Hain, who was privately briefed on what happened by an agent from Mossad. Okay, Hans Hain signed an affidavit. Here it is, quote, Right Minister Rudolf Hess was murdered at the instigation of the British Home Office. The murder was committed by 2 members of the British SAS, that's Special Air Service. The murder of Rudolf Hess had become necessary because the government of the USSR intended to release the prisoner. During the afternoon walk of the prisoner in the prison grounds, the 2 men lay in wait for the prisoner and throttled him with a 1.5 meter long cable. Then a suicide through quote unquote hanging was feigned.
Wow. Did Adolf Hitler ever come out and say, talk about this, that they basically kidnapped his?
No. If you read the memoirs of Otto Skorzeny, who was the man who rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop in a daring rescue mission. Yeah, Hitler told him, if you fail, I'll have to disown you. And say, I'll just have to disown you and say I had nothing to do with it. And he apparently told Hess the exact same thing. In fact, Hess, according to Hess's wife, said that Hess told Hitler that if I fail, they're going to milk me. They're going to milk me for all the information they can. Just disavow it. So that's what he did.
Got it.
Because he had no idea what was going to happen to Hess in the British prison. The idea was not for him to go to prison. The idea was to meet with this Lord Hamilton and other pro-peace British officials. They were hoping that Churchill would be overthrown. A lot of people who wanted to see Churchill overthrown, they were losing people. They lost people at Tobruk. They were suffering a lot of defeats. The Japanese at Singapore had taken the whole British garrison. A lot of people against this war wanted to see it end, but Churchill was under the control of the bankers. He wanted to keep it going. But the reason they had to kill Hess before his release was they could not let the British public know that hundreds of thousands of British soldiers had died for nothing. In fact, Hess had come with a peace plan signed by Hitler. They offered to pull out of Poland. They would set up an independent state for Poland, pull out of France. All they wanted to do was end the war. They demanded nothing from England. Unlike England, which had seized Germany's colonies after World War I, it seized Germany's fleet after World War I. They wanted nothing. They said, just end the war. That's what they were into. But They could not let Hess go home and tell this. By the way, I should mention that all the time that Spandau prison, Hess was never allowed to be interviewed by a journalist. Even his own family, which could see him, I think it was once a month, only ask him things like, how's the food, how's your health? They couldn't ask him any question about his flight or his anything political. And there was an American commandant, these rotating groups of soldiers who would guard Hess. And there was an American commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Byrd, back in the 60s, sat down with Hess and asked him about the flight. He was placed under arrest for doing that.
Wow.
Nobody wanted the truth to be known about Rudolf Hess. And so that was one of history's mysteries, and it's a mystery that's been greatly clarified.
Wow. Well, thank you. You've greatly clarified it today, because I was unaware that it went that deep. So, man, wow. Mm-hmm. I was unaware that he was bringing a peace treaty as well.
Oh, yeah, it was signed by Hitler. According to the British historian Peter Padfield, he brought a peace treaty signed by Hitler. By the way, the British are keeping all their documents about Hess classified until the year 2050, after which they'll probably classify them again if world state of affairs hasn't dramatically changed by then. But they still won't let the public see the original classified documents on Rudolf Hess. Wow. Well, we look forward to that happening, man. Hopefully it's in our lifetimes, right? Well, we just have to dig out the truth by ourselves, because the powers that be, the deep state's not going to let us know what really happened. So what do you say to people who talk about, Hitler's aggression was also to wipe the Jewish nation off of the European continent, and and I don't know how far you want to go into this topic, because I know it's so sensitive in terms of what is the Holocaust and what was the motivations behind the hatred for the Jews, or the supposed hatred. Can you at least touch on that topic? Because I know for so many of us that's exactly what we would think. That he was just wanted to take over the world and kill all the Jews. I mean, that's kind of the general consensus, at least in terms of the propaganda history that we've received. It's probably too much for us to get into today. We've covered a lot of territory. Right. I think we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. Yep. What I could say is that there certainly have been many distortions about it. Voltaire once said that if you want to know who rules over you, find out who you're not allowed to criticize. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've probably heard of the case of Ursula Haberback. She's an 87-year-old woman who was recently sent to prison in Germany because she said that Auschwitz was not an extermination camp, it was a work camp. And for this 87-year-old goes to prison. Now, I don't know of any other historical event that you can criticize and go to prison for. I mean, if I said that the Confederacy had a great victory at Gettysburg, you might think I was crazy. You're not going to send me to prison. Right. You can deny other Holocausts. You can, for example, Walter Duranty, who was a reporter for the New York Times, denied that there was any starvation in Ukraine at the time of the Holodomor, when 6 million people really did die from communist forced starvation. They were confiscating all grain. They even went into people's homes with hatchets, ripped down their walls to find hidden grain. 6 million people died, including 3 million children. Walter Duranty denied that. He won a Pulitzer Prize. But, David Irving asked questions about gas chambers during the Holocaust. He went to prison.
Yep.
So again, if you want to know who you rolled over by, you need to see who you're not allowed to criticize. Ask who books on Amazon. Just recently, for the first time, Amazon has started suppressing books. There's a lot of distortion about this. A book that I would recommend people read is Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry. He's Jewish himself, so it's pretty hard to call him an anti-Semite. And there is a movie out there called The Greatest Story Never Told, which talks a lot about alternative views of this event.
Oh, yeah, that's a great documentary.
I will have to say this, that Hitler was in his bunker trying to fight a two-front war. His attention was not on the camps. What we did have occurring in those camps was a situation where Germany was totally bombed out. The Luftwaffe was history. Fighter planes from both Russia and the Allies on the western side were strafing trains and people, anything that moved on the ground at will. Food trains could not get to these camps. They were overcrowded because they were moving them from the east to get away from the Russians. They were overcrowded. Typhus broke out. There was a lot of death from disease. A lot of very scientific historians such as Gamma Rudolph, who's a physicist who studied the Max Planck Institute, have written very intellectually on this subject. And I would just invite people to investigate it more thoroughly. We can't get into detail today, but basically Germany needed people who were not suitable for the armed forces. This included criminals. It included Russian POWs. It included a number of Jews, but there were Jews in the German army even during World War II. There's a book out there called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers that you can pick up. So not all Jews were in the camps, but they basically were looking for work camps to make uniforms, artificial rubber. They couldn't get rubber, aircraft parts, and so forth. And at the end of the war, when Germany was devastated and everybody, for the most part, was starving, yes, starvation and then disease set in, and some of these camps had to be quarantined. People couldn't leave them because of the quarantine. And when the Allied troops arrived, they were in horrible condition. But if you look at the Red Cross reports from the earlier 1940s, the camps were not in these horrific conditions you see photographed at the end of the war. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But it's an area that
even guys like David Irving don't say that there were no atrocities done, but he says that the numbers were lied about and that Hitler's connection to it has never actually been proven, and so. And you have to say, like, who benefited from the story of the Holocaust? I mean, I hate to say that, and I'm not trying to say there wasn't any atrocities. Of course there were, but who benefited from of a blown up number of how many people died, or who benefited from that? And you can see the communists benefited, the globalists benefit, the Zionists benefit. They're all kind of the same family anyway, and it goes on, and we could go on for hours and hours and hours. Going through the chronology of the last 100 years, and it would all kind of paint the picture of where we're at even today, what we're experiencing.
Yes.
And, that's for another time, I know, but it's so vital to understand where we came from. Otherwise, like this famous quote is, we'll be doomed to repeat history if we don't understand it. And so
that's what the whole alt media is doing. Yep. We are peeling off the layers of lies in order that people can understand the history, in order that people don't repeat it. Because believe me, the powers that be want to repeat it. They just repeated it with this fake sarin gas attack. Absolutely.
James, I can't tell you how incredible this time was with you. It's like, again, one of the biggest reasons I even wanted to get into media, and we started it literally 1 year ago, and 2 weeks from now will be our 1 year anniversary. And one of the reasons I did it was because I just wanted to talk to amazing people. And, even though I'm sure you have a lot of fans, but if I called you and just say, hey, I'm a fan, you want to hang on the phone for a while, maybe you wouldn't have responded to me. But hey, what if I record it and put it out there on the internet? Now we're talking. So this has just been so much fun for me on one level, but then on another level to help get these perspectives out there. And again, this is James' perspective. Do your own research. Come up with your, figure out this on your own. You can take what James is saying with a grain of salt, but I think what you're saying is what the dots that you are connecting, they really hold the test of time, man. They you can throw it against the wall and it bounces back, man. And if it's bullshit, it usually doesn't do that. And so I really, really appreciate what you're doing. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing. If there's any way we can support you in what you're doing, please reach out. But thanks for coming on today, man. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I should probably just backtrack when I said fake sarin gas attack. I haven't studied this much. I don't know that no sarin gas was used, but just I know that they're trying to blame it on Assad, which is the last thing he's going to do. Just want a big victory in Aleppo. He's not about to attack his own people. And by the way, I go to a church with people from Syria, and they love Assad, and they know the score there. But thank you for having me on. The deep state has been controlling mainstream media for a long time. As you know, there's 6 corporations that run mainstream media, and they really interlock at the top anyway. And so they give you a consensus view of what's going on. It's only in alt media that you can find the truth. So, and so we're very much, I consider it very much like we are prosecutors in a courtroom, and the establishment, they've got these high-priced defense attorneys. They're making CNN. They're making their case, but their case doesn't make sense. Our case does make sense. Their facts don't add up. Our facts do add up, and so we're just appealing to the jury, the public out there, and saying, whose side seems to be motivated by the truth, and whose information seems to be truthful, and let them choose themselves.
Amen. You said it, brother. Thank you, James. So this was great. I hope to have you on again in the future. But for anyone listening, please pick up one of James's books. Check out his website at james-perloff.com. Check him out on Twitter. He's constantly writing. I mean, he talks about modern events. Pick up his book, and he has an incredible perspective on global affairs, and even right now into the present day. So thank you, James. You're the man.
Okay, you're the man too. And we're all the man in this. A lot of the mans in this.
Oh yeah. Well, you're right. I'm the man in my world, and you're the man in yours. But thanks, dude.